Well, when I took this job as IndyStar opinion editor 2.5 years ago, we had no voices, no columnists. It was just me sitting around writing a bunch of columns by myself. I knew that needed to change, and the first person I reached out to was the person joining me right now, Ball State University economist and professor Michael Hicks. His column had appeared in IndyStar in years past, but wasn't at the time that I took this job. But he has written a column for almost 20 years, and that is part of his role at Ball State. Um, and even through that time, had been a regular name within IndyStar because of the research that he does and a lot of the insights that he had to offer. So he was certainly no stranger to our audience here. I knew I wanted to get those insights in a more regular interval. So I reached out, and he was all for bringing our column back into IndyStar. And I've had the pleasure of editing him now during much of that period. And just incredible impact that his column has had through IndyStar and for our audience. He's written especially great columns about education, about the need for a better quality of life in Indiana. The impact is clear in that Senator Jim Banks is celebrating his departure and the ending of his column, which is coming soon. But getting a little bit ahead of myself there, you're retiring from Ball State. Tell us a little bit about why this is the right time to retire and what you're doing next.
Well, I'm in a Center for Business and Economic Research. This is a R2 University, Research Center. It's the third one I've been in, and I've been leading it for 19 years, which is a really long time to be doing that. So I had for a while wanted to step down, and my sort of co-hosted the research at the center, Dagny Falk, Dr. Dagny Falk, is going to take over. Her kids she's now empty nesting like I have been for a few years now, and so it was a really good time for that. I'm leaving that. I've been in a research center leadership now for 25 of the past 29 years that I've been a professor or an academic, and so it's definitely time to do something else. I'm going to Shenandoah University, which is a private university in Northern Virginia, Winchester, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. I'm going to be director of the School of Business inside a College of Business, Engineering, and Technology. So it's a bigger college, and I'm on the business side, and going to be teaching economics classes in a couple of weeks, macroeconomics this semester, and doing some of the same things that, of course, that I have done here. I'm also affiliated. I'll be affiliated with Ball State and do research for some time. We're under contract and work that I'm doing. I'm also a research fellow at West Virginia University in the Center on Rural Innovation, and I work with a couple of think tanks, and will continue to do that work on the side. So I don't tend to really slow down, but I'm not going to be writing a weekly column, which is the real, one of the real joyful outcomes of this work here in Indiana, and I'm going to back away from that and try to think a little bit deeper than I'm able to sometimes in columns, and so I'm looking forward to that different opportunity.
Well, we'll be thrilled to have your column at any interval that you're willing to provide it for us. So a couple of things that you have absolutely convinced me of during the time that you've been doing this column are that the most important issues in Indiana are related to education and quality of life. You've had a rich life experience, but your past almost 20 years have been spent in Indiana. You're now heading to another state, another university. As you leave Indiana, at least as a permanent resident, I'm curious what you see the outlook as for Indiana. You've written about this quite a bit, but I'm sure you've had reason to be a little bit more reflective in recent weeks and months. What do you think the prospects are for Indiana, sort of summing up the totality of your research and the writing that you've done?
That's a great question, and I have been thinking of it pretty deeply. Let me preface this by saying I'm a pretty meat and potatoes economist. My politics are that of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, John McCain. I'm center right guy, classical liberal, and so when I came into economics, I was very much wedded to small taxes. The sort of picture of economic policy that you might have seen, you saw when Mitch Daniels came to Indiana. And so I think my own technical research in looking at all the counties in the U.S. over 60 years and evaluating what are the things that are driving people and economic activity to or from those places informs my perspective on what I think about Indiana. And so when I got here, Indiana ranked. It had been through a difficult period of time with the job losses associated primarily with automation of the automobile sector and parts sector from the 1970s onward. Had lost about a third of factory jobs, and that hollowed out places like where I live in Muncie or Terre Haute and Kokomo and Fort Wayne, and had really battered the state. And Mitch Daniels did much to improve the business climate to attract the location. But what really was missing were the dynamic elements of the modern economy, which are, as any economist will tell you, a really high proportion of well-educated residents. And so I think my second preface to all this is like there's no disputation in economics that economic growth is primarily driven by human capital and access to human capital. And all the other things that we think about, dollars to build capital investment and infrastructure and business talent and all the other things that are ultimately important to this market-driven economy, this fantastic dynamic American economy, all comes down to the brains and the education and skills of the men and women that inhabit it. And so if you're in a place that is below the national average in educational attainment, your growth is going to be slower than the national average. It still might be better than France or Germany or Austria, but you're not going to be competing with the United States. When I arrived here in 2007, Indiana ranked 38th in educational attainment. That is the share of adults with a 4-year degree. We were a little bit higher in graduation rates in high school. That's been pretty static, but to be quite candid, a high school diploma is not really any longer a gateway to long-term employment and a solid middle-class job. In the 20 years that we've been here, we've done some things that I think were initially designed to improve that. We push college and universities to be more comprehensive, to get our credit line aligned so we could get kids out in 4 years. We incentivized doing that, which telling kids good things about their the majors that they're choosing and lining them up and making sure we have the classes for all of them. The broad school choice, which I continue to support, allowed families to move to schools that introduced real competition into the performance of local public schools, and then transferred some money to private schools so that families without choices could get into private schools. And then we botched the overall funding. We have cut the share of our GDP that we're spending on higher ed by a third. We've cut our spending per capita is now lower than it was in 2010 in inflation adjusted terms. So we have now a teaching profession that is, I don't know why a young teacher would choose Indiana. It's the now like 42nd or 44th lowest paid, has had the lowest pay growth of any state of the last 15 years. We went from 38th to 42nd in educational attainment. And I think the big scary thing is that when I got here, we were sending 65% of our college or high school graduates, which is just over half, 54% of each cohort off to college. And that's now down to 52%. That was below the national average, which was about 75%. Now we're down to 52, 53% of our graduates going to college. That's about 48% of a 18-year-old cohort each year. That is not going to catch us up. So think about if you're in a race and you're way behind, you need to be running faster than the people in front of you. And there are places like Massachusetts and Illinois and Virginia and Maryland and California just running fast away from us. But the bigger problem is we're not even at the replacement rate. So if you do the math on that 48% of a cohort going to college, and you see how many of them actually finish and graduate in 6 years and stay in Indiana, which is a decreasing share, we're not even producing enough college graduates to stay at the 29, 30% that we are now, that's going to really cripple Indiana's economy. So my forecast is that all the bells and whistles, the nifty stuff that we think we'll do at the edge on tax policy or incentivizing more people to have families, all the little things we're doing is going to be swamped by this big failure to get people post-secondary education that will drive us to prosperity. And so as I leave Indiana, I'm pretty concerned that our incumbent workforce, in terms of its relative quality to the rest of the country, is in long-term decline. And I think that's going to plague us for most of the rest of the 21st century.
I want to drill down into some of that, but first I want to back up for a moment and touch on something that you brought up, which is your identity. When I arrived in Indiana in 2015, I became familiar with your work and came to understand you as a conservative-leaning economist, and you sort of validated that view a moment ago by placing yourself in a center-right tradition. I can tell you that over the last 2.5 years, I have received no conservative cred for your presence in the IndyStar opinion section. As I referenced earlier, Senator Jim Banks is celebrating your departure. What happened? Did you change, or did the conservative movement change?
Yeah, I am, if anything, more convinced of the classical liberal, the conservative viewpoint that I adopted as a young man that took me into 8 years as an Army officer. You can see behind me those 3 children there, and 2 in uniform are all 3 veterans, 2 still on active duty. I'm a conservative. The conservative movement disappeared. So I'll just quote George Will. I haven't really left the Republican Party because I don't belong to parties. I'm unclubbable, but I don't support the Republican Party today for the same reason that I did in 1980s, because I'm a conservative. And so what happened is men like Jim Banks and certainly much of the GOP have abandoned the traditional 3 elements of conservatism that really mattered. The national security conservatism is out the picture. We're fighting a losing war in Iran and ignoring our biggest enemies elsewhere. We've abandoned any fiscal rectitude. 1/4 of all the national debt is due to Donald Trump's 5.5 years in office. And certainly the intractable lack of judgment in passing a couple of big spending tax cut bills. And then in terms of social conservatism, the abandonment of the principles of our founding, respect for the individual, which is also a central element of Christianity and, of course, other Abrahamic religions and elsewhere, is what has run away from national politics. So the people who are complaining about you saying that I'm not a conservative are people who are embracing the president's extra constitutional wars and big spending politics, and are trying to run off immigrants and people of color, and that have generally been a part of the conservative movement in the United States, particularly if you look at the farewell speech of President Reagan, which I would encourage all your readers or listeners to do on YouTube. Those principles are gone, and so they're just mad that I'm not part of that 5% of Americans who think prosecuting illegal wars and spending ourselves into debt and hunting down people who lived here 30 or 40 years is part of the portfolio of conservative thought. So sorry you're not getting any credit for that, but in the long term you will. Those enduring principles of our founding will endure long after we have abandoned whatever principleless environment we're in now.
I actually, came of age as identifying as a Republican, and in my late teens, early 20s. I'm not a good spokesperson for the modern right, but if I can try to channel them for a moment, I think some of the Republicans who don't like you would say, all right, in Indiana, we have repeatedly cut taxes, and we just cut property taxes again. We're talking about cutting taxes even more in the upcoming legislative session or beyond. And here you are, Professor Hicks, criticizing us at every turn. And you yourself said a few moments ago that you were for low taxes, and now you're criticizing Republicans for cutting taxes in Indiana. So what's going on? What do you want from us? I think
right.
I think the line might go something like that. And how would you
respond
to that?
And that is a great debate. What I would say is that if you look at the conservative thought from Locke and Adam Smith, um, peppered in with the classical liberalism of John Stuart Mill, what you would see is that we collect taxes to do something. We're not just collecting taxes for no purpose. We're collecting taxes to provide public services. And the public services that a state and local government do, right? So federal government's the one with a big deficit. We don't have a deficit in Indiana. We have a surplus that we're not spending. The public services that matter most to us in the value of our home and in long-term growth are really state and local spending. It's on things as banal as water sewer systems, roads, ensuring that there is heating and air conditioning in an elementary school, that there are bus systems that transport kids to school, that we have public safety, that we can police people who are homeless off the streets and provide public services for them, that we provide jail and public safety in fire and security. The cuts that local governments, the cuts that the legislature has made to Indiana's property taxes, local government, are so large at this point that we're seeing school corporations not just ask for more money through referendum that they're allowed to do, but are ending. At least one school corporation said, "Look, we're ending bus service this year, so you're going to have to get your kids to school." It's in a rural suburban area. And so that's going to be everywhere in 2 years. And all you had to do is do the math on local government. Every consultant, London Witty Group, TP, all these consulting groups that help local governments do finance. I know all these guys. They're solid. Most of them are center right, sort of business conservative, business Republicans. And they're like, I can't believe this. We defunded police in 50 or 75 communities that are now no longer running police police tours on the evenings and in the middle of the week, right? So we just have police on call, or we're sharing it with local government. We've never been at a point where we're spending less on local government. Our share of GDP on local government is the lowest it's been since we've been keeping data in the state. The share of local government employment per capita is the lowest it's been since we've been keeping record. So the tax cuts that have come here have not been connected at all to the cost and the importance of public services. And what I try to explain to people is, if you want your economy to grow, you have to do things that people would want to move to your community. And increasingly, much more so than 40, 50 years ago, when I was young, families, young mobile families care about how good are the public schools, how safe are the streets, is my home going to grow in value if I live here? And if you're just cutting taxes in an effort to try to grow your economy, you're going to be very disappointed to find that the people who are driving your economy are willing to pay higher taxes to have better schools, better police, better maintained roads, better parks, better public safety. And the Republicans, the large number of Republicans here in Indiana, don't get that. And I think that is going to be, and I'm in the legislature, the mayors all get it, but the legislature is really struggling with, I think it's a fundamental point of public policy.
That's a good segue back into your broader remarks on the outlook for Indiana. So if you are an average family in Indiana, or even considering moving to Indiana for some reason, should you have confidence that your children can get a high quality K-12 education in Indiana?
You can, but you have to be very careful where you go, right? And the reason for that is, look, just right now, the funding is so tough that there are just under 300 school corporations in Indiana. And about 60 of them, almost all in rural communities, don't offer any AP STEM classes. So I can just tell you, as a professor here at a state university and a STEM degree going to a private university, we don't want any of those kids in college. If you haven't had an AP science, technology, engineering, math, AP class, you are not ready for college, and I don't care what you do. Your general education requirements are going to demand that you learn some science and technology, engineering, or math, and you're not ready. And so what we're already saying now is, for about 1 in 4 school corporations, probably about 10% of kids, because these are smaller schools, they're not ready. Now, Mitch Daniels, the president of Purdue, will say, "Oh, we'll catch those kids up," but he's not taking those kids voluntarily. He's got a couple from each school corporation they're going to take. They're just not, those kids aren't ready. And we know that across the board. So
And I'm guessing a lot of those kids end up now at a place like Ball State, especially as we're seeing enrollment declines and the demographics aren't favorable to higher education. So I'm guessing, schools like, the one that you're retiring from are probably going to pick up some of those students. Am I right?
No, those kids will come to college because we're going to accept, everybody's going to get accepted to college in an environment of lower enrollment. You're just not going to be very successful. You're not going to have access to the majors that are really good. You're not going to, you can work your way into it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, my late father was a well-known scientist, graduated from Candleton High School with 22 other kids, which is now an F school, was probably an F school when he graduated in the late 1940s. He went off to 4 years in Navy, then 4 years at Evansville, and 2 at Purdue, then got a PhD in Denver. You can catch up in those areas, but what we're saying is the high school in those 60, 1 out of 4 schools is not preparing any of its kids for the rigors of a Ball State, a IUPU, IU, Purdue, Indianapolis, any of the state universities. And so there will be a place for you. You can get into those, but you're not going to waltz into an engineering program at Purdue and be successful. You certainly are not going to waltz into a pre-med program at IU or Butler or Ball State and be successful. And that is a damn shame. And there's just no other way to articulate it. And then if you go up from that, probably another half of schools are offering a very narrow set of those experiences to students. And I'm not just holding the legislature to task for it. The school boards there are somehow can't cobble together money to offer these classes. They're not thinking they're important enough, and maybe they aren't in the communities. But these are full of rural Hoosiers, people my demographic, Protestant, Scots-Irish background who have been around for a long time, and also a lot of minorities. And so particularly Hispanic and African-American students are in some of these schools, and they're just not being prepared. And so, when we laugh at when you hear legislators from many of these places, and I won't name all of them, I could go through, I just named Candleton, which it should have been closed. They'll make fun of, or they'll berate like Indianapolis public schools. It's a large urban school corporation, but they have people going to Ivy Leagues every year. Right? They are succeeding in many ways. And so if I'm a parent moving to Indiana, I'm going to choose very carefully a school corporation that is really rigorous. Certainly the big urban schools around Indianapolis are doing that. I feel pretty good about my kids went at Yorktown High School. They went off to Air Force Academy, West Point, Virginia Military Institute did real well. They were prepared very well without having dad sit through any homework experience after about 4th grade. And so there are certainly places to go, but I would be very nervous about going to a rural school or a small school, even if I thought it was really great for my younger kids, because so few of them now are making kids college ready that I think it's going to be a real burden over the next couple of decades, unless the legislature actually decides to allocate enough resources to get schools to do this. And again, it may require other things, consolidation and more rigorous teaching requirements and other stuff. It's not just a dollar issue, but the dollars also matter deeply.
Well, that brings us to higher ed, and you're steeped in that world. And the past few years, we've seen some controversial legislation having to do with higher education in Indiana. What is your sense of what Indiana's view of higher ed is right now? Like, what does Indiana think higher education is for? Who is it for? What are we doing here with colleges?
I have written both in your paper and before that, critical of the excesses of the woke university. And again, having been a conservative on campus as a graduate student and as a faculty member for all these many years, I've certainly rubbed up against some of the wackiness. What I tell people is that wackiness doesn't really transmit to the classroom in most instances. It makes some of the navigating campus politics hard for a faculty member, and it might. There may be some students have been overrun, but largely, if you come to Ball State University, you're going to run into a bunch of people who are different than you. They're going to present different ideas to you, but they want to date you. They want to have you on their team or their club. They want you in their major. And there's just not politicking talk in class. Certainly not in like an economics class. I'm too busy trying to make sure you can do the algebra and the calculus, not the making sure you're voting for somebody. I tell students up front, I don't care who you vote for. You shouldn't care who I vote for. I really care how well you do in the first test, and if you read the syllabus, and that's about it. And so that stuff is much less than it's depicted. I do think many colleges and universities have sort of strayed away from a core mission as providing an education that's broad enough to prepare people for a life of learning, but also fit them with tools that can be good for the labor market and be honest with them about it. I think that's largely changed now because there's so much information. I mean, kids now today can, find anything on the interweb, right? And so the idea that you don't know that getting what the economic outcome is going to be from a particular degree is just, sort of ridiculous. That kids don't know. You think kids don't know this. And so mostly leveled by people who have to rely on those same kids to set their cable TV up. And so I think that's a noxious argument. I think most Hoosiers respect higher education. They appreciate education. I think many of them, even if they know it's not for everybody, I actually think higher ed of some type is for everybody. That higher ed may be, I'm going to get a degree in plumbing, or I'm going to learn a manufacturing technology associate's degree. Those are very credible and important skills. I myself spent the first 8 years out of college. I went to college to become an Army officer because I couldn't imagine sitting at a desk all day. Went off and my parents were pressuring me to go to college. And I went off and spent the next 8 years, very little time behind a desk. And so I respect that. I appreciate that. I think most Hoosiers appreciate it. I don't think most Hoosiers are fully aware of how badly the resources that the state has provided has been cut to schools, and mostly because it really mostly impacts the poorest Hoosiers. We stopped giving scholarships to. It's changed what schools they go to. So if you look at the loss of attendance at state from high school graduates in Indiana, the number that go out of state hasn't changed, right? The number that go to private schools out of state hasn't changed. And by the way, when those kids leave, they ain't never coming back. The proportion of kids that go to in-state private schools has not changed. The entire loss of enrollment in state universities are coming primarily, they're all in-state public universities. And those are the places where almost all the graduates remain in state. So the brain drain that we're seeing is not so much hitting that age cohort, is that it's hitting Indiana. So we're sending as many kids out of state to almost the exact number as we did in 2015. They're gone. The ones that go to private schools, they're gone. The ones that are most likely to make a life in Indiana after graduating are the Ball State grads, the ISU grads, the IU and Purdue grads, and their enrollment numbers are really dropping. And I think I think it will take a really strong communication from an opposition candidate for governor to explain how badly the damage has been and how much that's going to affect the future. I think there are individual families that are feeling it. All of my kids are gone. They're not coming back. Most of my friends' kids are gone. They finished their degree in Indiana or elsewhere, and they're gone. And I think that as Hoosiers wake up to the fact that we're not building an economy, we're not building a state that's really attractive to young families, until we really get that, we're not going to change our tax policy and our spending policy towards education and quality of life.
You talked a moment ago about post-secondary education as a function of job training, and that seems to be the through line for education policy in Indiana. We're reorienting high school diplomas around that. We're closing college degree programs with an emphasis on which are the most likely to train someone for a career, as opposed to maybe some humanities programs, some other fields. Is that a good direction for Indiana to go in? Are we setting students up for a more focused, more efficient path from K-12 through higher ed, or are there some problems that we're introducing now?
Right. Generally, I think it's very important to inform families and students what the potential job opportunities would be out there. And again, you almost have to be a village idiot not to understand that being a finance major is going to pay more than being an arts major on average. If you're a really good arts major, you're going to outpace any finance person. So, and I think young people have the skills when they walk into college to do that. It's not, again, they can find some obscure musician that none of us have ever heard of and learn their music. They sure as heck can find out how much an archaeologist or an anthropologist or an economist gets paid after their bachelor's degree or post-secondary education. Dictating to what, treating people like elements of capital or widgets is sort of one reason why I'm a conservative. That's what socialist governments do, right? Is say we're going to allocate people to different tasks in our economy because we're omnipotent and omniscient, and we know exactly what the economy, what jobs and skills are going to be needed next year, and that's just rubbish. And so what we ought to be doing as universities is making a very strong appeal to a general liberal, small L liberal education core, that we're teaching people to read, write, communicate, understand their place in the world really well, and then providing with enough professional degree that they can enter a career. We should not be preparing them for a job. We should be preparing them for a career. And a career means that you're going to have to relearn over and over and over again. And so the important thing of a public education, of a four-year degree, the most important, the most resilient part of a four-year degree are those first 2 years that train you really broadly to do mathematics, to understand the scientific method, to read critically, to write and communicate effectively. And then the other classes, the economics, I'm in a STEM degree, so I'm teaching finance and macroeconomics. That stuff changes like crazy. What doesn't change, right, is the ability to do mathematics, the ability to communicate crisply and effectively, to read critically. And so you can train in a professional school. I'm going to lead a professional program. If you don't have a solid core, the stuff that the career-minded education wants to squeeze out of the curriculum for speed to get these widgets into the economy earlier, what you're doing is crippling young people in their pursuit down the road of better, bigger opportunities, both in education and in the career field. Again, right now, entrance to the middle class means you have to have some post-secondary degree, either training for a really skilled trade or four-year degree. And we've had people, including former presidents of Ivy Tech and former lieutenant governors, saying bad talking four-year degree. There are people that listen to them, but remember, their kids all went to graduate school, right? And so it'd be really good to keep reminding people, all those folks who are bad talking college because they think they can score political gains, all their kids are at private universities in the Northeast, or they're getting their master's degree in engineering right now. And so watch what people do, not what they say. And I think that would give you a much better insight into where people who are successful think opportunities really lie. And it's always going to be in more, not less education.
One of the most interesting research findings you've written about in recent months is this counterintuitive revealed preference that people choose to live in places with high taxes. Uh, what's behind that? Why are people going where the taxes are high?
Isn't that weird? Because you turn on cable TV and you hear, oh, people are leaving California for Texas. What they don't tell you is if you go down to the county level, they're leaving the low tax parts of California, state and local, and they're going to the high tax parts of Texas. And within state migration in Texas, and it's true of every state, people are leaving the low tax places to the high tax places. Here in Indiana, it's a stunning graphic. It's on social media, and I've shared it on my Substack page. People are moving, population change and migration are very much from low tax to high tax places. And either there's only two possible explanations for this. One is people are just ridiculously ignorant, which is a pretty bad way to judge people who are making the most important decisions, financial decisions of their life, for where do they buy a home, where do they have a job, where do they pay taxes. Or they're increasingly valuing the public services that those taxes pay for that are specific to that region. So a safer, better school building for their kids, better roads, a better sewer system, which I'm experiencing in Muncie as we're flooding everywhere off campus here. They want access to parks. They want to have their kids to be able to go to a little league field that is not full of trash, that the grass is cut on. Those are the things that there's police presence, that if there's a fire at my home, there'll be an actual professional fire department come in a few minutes to help put out the fire. Those are the things that people look for. And ironically, a little bit higher taxes in those areas generally pays off. It's capitalized into the value of your home. If you've got better schools, you're more likely to have, in the places that have better schools, have much more higher property value growth. That's the revealed preference, that people are moving there. Places that are safer are more valuable. So if you have a community that has a solid, effective police force in controlling crime, and the other services that go with it, it's not just cops. It's, do you have the social safety net that's local? Do you have the training and the access to social workers that can help people who are in crisis before they commit crimes or violent crimes? And so all of that stuff comes at a cost. And what we're lucky about in Indiana is that our cost of providing those services is like the 6th or 7th lowest in the country. It's really low. And the places where it's pretty high, Hamilton County, Boone County, it's coming so fast. People are moving there at such a rapid pace that they're running out of room. And so that conundrum that you described, that people are actually moving to high tax places, is not because of the taxes. Clearly, it's because they value deeply those services. And communities that choose not to tax to provide those services should expect people to leave on net. And that's what's happening, not just here in Indiana, but across the Midwest.
You mentioned just a moment ago, Boone and Hamilton counties, two places where quality of life is just visibly, obviously high and getting higher. But would you say for the 19 years that you've lived in Indiana, are most places in Indiana experiencing improving or worsening quality of life?
So I think, absent a 30 or 40 rural counties, most of Indiana's quality of life is improving. The problem is it's not improving as fast as it is in much of the rest of the country. And so the relative quality of life is not clear to me that it's getting better. And so the way we measure quality of life is, how much more would you pay to live there? And so places where, like, I'm in Muncie. I just sold my home. It was a lovely home. I sold it for less than it cost to build in 1991. I bought it from somebody much later than that, so I made a little bit of money on it. But I have to insure it another 20-25% over its market value, because people aren't willing to move to Muncie to have that home. If you pick that home up and move to Chicago, it'd be a $2 million home, or DC area, it'd be a $3 million home. And so there are places in Indiana, and Muncie is one of them, that are really struggling to make the place that is attractive enough that you get the home. People want to move there enough to push the value of the home up to the construction cost threshold. There are about 60 counties in Indiana where that's the case, 60 to 70 counties where that's the case. And we only really have a dozen counties that are growing faster than the nation as a whole. And those are all in the urban area, the donut counties of Indianapolis, Porter, Lake, and then Floyd County in the south, and maybe Allen County, and that's it. And the rest of the state is either growing slower than the nation or is in absolute decline. And if we took immigrants out of it, we would have another 30 or so counties that would be losing population. And when you're losing population, you're in really long-term problems. And so those counties, or those metro areas that are actually losing people, are really facing a long-term challenge. And I don't think enough Hoosiers understand that. Otherwise, you wouldn't have people opposing every type of development that comes along, and at the same time pushing for tax cuts and more factory jobs that are just never materializing, which remains, I think, the mindset in a lot of rural or places outside of the more affluent counties, dozen counties in the state.
What is a core belief that you have changed your mind on over the last 19 years at Ball State?
That tax one is a big one and empirical. So it's not a core belief that when I got here, just before I got here, Stephen Moore actually wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal citing some research I'd done on tax incentives in Michigan. And he's a big advocate for small taxes. I was very convinced that we needed to do some things with taxes in the Daniels administration here in Indiana. Worked pretty heavily on it. Did awful lot of research. Probably the first 6 or 7 papers that I published here was that. Then I wrote a really big study on the Kernan Shepherd local government consolidation that turned into a book that my colleague Dagny and I published in 2012. Mitch Daniels wrote the introduction to that very kindly. And so I came here really believing low taxes were going to make a big difference, and they didn't. And so I really started digging deeper into why they didn't work and why we were seeing a reversal of where people were migrating. Instead of the footloose pattern to low tax places, we saw it change to higher tax places. That's a fundamental thing. The other thing that I changed my mind on was the Medicaid expansion. That was the Affordable Care Act. I was very critical of that. I was critical in interviews in the IndyStar, in columns, in 2010 to 2012. I was extraordinarily critical of what that would do. Turns out that really was not a big deal. Many of the negative things that I thought would happen didn't happen. And a lot of negative things that I didn't anticipate actually did happen. So I was pretty wrong about that. And I think what did happen was that we saw hospitals consolidate like crazy and just tell the legislature, look, Obamacare is killing me. I got to build this monopoly for efficiency. And they ended up just absolutely eviscerating the pocketbook of Hoosiers. And they had now for almost 15 years.
Michael Hicks, you have contributed much to the discourse in Indiana, much to our understanding of important issues, and much to IndyStar. And for that, I'm very thankful, and I'm glad your column isn't entirely going away, just reducing in frequency. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.